We are affiliated with Brigham Young University and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. However, these particular classes, this one in particular, is intended for a general audience. And please keep that in mind if you have questions that would pertain solely to a church audience. We would like to thank Sarah for her taking her time and preparing for this class. And we enjoyed thoroughly her class last week, the first in this series, and I'm sure we will the second today. So we'll now turn the time over to her.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for coming back if you were here last time. My last webinar was all about autosomal DNA testing. So typically when people say I took a DNA test, they're talking about autosomal DNA testing, which tests the DNA that you inherit from both of your parents, both of their parents, and on back, all branches of your family tree. They may, if someone has taken a DNA test like that, they may have taken this test through Ancestry or 23andMe or perhaps another company. I'm not going to be talking about that kind of testing today. I'm going to be talking about two other kinds of DNA testing that are out there. These types of tests can be used to solve some specific types of research questions because of how the particular pattern in which this DNA is inherited. So one of the kinds of DNA that we're going to talk about is mitochondrial DNA, and the other is Y-DNA. Just a review of some information from last time. Most of our DNA we share with most living things, and about 99.9% of our DNA we share with every other human on the planet. So DNA testing focuses on that small percentage of genes that vary between different humans. So the three main types of unique DNA testing are autosomal DNA, which we covered at length last time. Autosomal DNA will give you an ethnicity breakdown. It may say you're 50% English, you're 25% West African, and they'll also tell you in an autosomal DNA test how closely related you are to someone else who's tested. Autosomal DNA changes quickly over the generations because it gets reshuffled every time a new generation happens. So you have half from your parents, but you have specific halves that they got from their parents and so forth. And that's how they are able to look at the amount of DNA you share with a particular person and say, this is probably a first cousin or a second cousin or so forth. So Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA are different because they change slowly over the generations. They don't get reshuffled as much because of the way in which they're inherited. A father will give his entire Y chromosome to his son, but he will not give a Y chromosome to his daughter. Mutations on the Y chromosome happen infrequently because of it not being recombined and just being passed down directly along the paternal line. There still will be occasional mutations just because of the nature of any living thing. Mutations just kind of happen with copying over time, but often a father and a son will have identical Y chromosomes with no mutations different. Y-DNA, they say it mutates about once every 150 years. There's a mutation. I'll talk a little bit more about that. Mitochondrial DNA test examines the DNA in your mitochondria. Every cell in your body has what's called a mitochondrion, and then you have a bunch of them, and the scientific way to say all of them is your mitochondria. These mitochondria help produce energy for cells throughout your body, and they actually have their own DNA that's different from the DNA anywhere else in your body. Mitochondrial DNA comes only through the maternal line. Sometimes I will call this the umbilical cord line when I'm trying to explain it to people, because it's, you know, before you were born, who were you connected to by an umbilical cord? That's who you got it from, and the same for her, and so on and so forth. So males and females both will inherit mitochondrial DNA, but then only females will go on to pass it down. And this chart is just a good visual of how that inheritance process works. If it was a male who'd taken Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA test, then they would have inherited the Y-DNA in the fashion shown with the blue boxes, and they would have inherited mitochondrial DNA from the ancestors shown in the pink boxes. Men can take both kinds of tests because they've inherited both kinds of DNA. Women can only take the mitochondrial DNA test. So as I said before, mitochondria have their own distinct DNA. It's inherited only from your mother. It changes slowly over time. The mutation rates of mitochondrial DNA are not as predictable as it is with Y-DNA. So that variability makes it a little bit trickier to use it to figure out how closely related two people are. Because if you don't have a steady rate of mutation, then you can't, extrapolate that to say, okay, a mutation happened every 200 years and you have two mutations different, so it's about this. You can't do that as easily with mitochondrial DNA. If you do take a mitochondrial DNA test, your results will be categorized as belonging to one of about 4,000 haplogroups. Members of a haplogroup share specific mutations that indicate they share a common female ancestor. That common ancestor could have lived thousands of years ago. And beyond the haplogroup, if you are in the same haplogroup as someone, you can then compare the number of mutations you have in common. And the more you have in common, the fewer differences, the more recently you have a shared ancestor on the direct female line. So the geneticists have studied mitochondrial DNA signatures of many populations around the world. And so because of this, you will at least get the information that tells you where in the world your direct maternal line ancestors were most likely from. It won't necessarily tell you how long ago you had an ancestor move from one of those locations, but it gives you an idea. You can get just the haplogroup information from 23andMe or from a living DNA test, but if you take the actual mitochondrial DNA test from Family Tree DNA, they not only give you the haplogroup information, which is what part of the world your mitochondrial DNA comes from, but also they will give you mutation information to allow you to make a more specific comparison between yourself and others who are in that haplogroup. It's a little bit limited in its use for genealogy research because even if you share the exact same haplogroup and mutation with a person, your shared ancestor could be many hundreds of years ago, sometimes even 1,000 years ago. And so it's a little bit limited in what it can do in that way, but there are some interesting applications of mitochondrial DNA. So they also, like both Y-DNA and mitochondrial DNA, use letters A through Z to represent the different haplogroups. So that's something to be careful of if somebody's telling you about their haplogroup, to find out, is this their Y or is this their mitochondrial haplogroup? Because they both use letters and they don't always represent the same parts of the world. They each have their own system. By studying mitochondrial DNA in different worldwide populations, science has found that the most ancient mitochondrial groups are found in Africa, and the one that's classified as the oldest on Earth is L1. So you'll see subgroups of these main haplogroups that have additional letters and numbers added to the end. L1b, H5a, those are just some examples of subgroups that have been formed. So this is an example of some mitochondrial DNA results from Family Tree DNA. These are my grandfather's results. So if you were able to click on it, you could click on the map. It would show you where this group came from. There's a description of the haplogroup, and then there's some information about which specific mutations he has. He took this test just kind of out of curiosity about 10 years ago. At the time, he was just told, yeah, you belong to haplogroup H, which is a really common European haplogroup. His mother was from Newfoundland, Canada, and her family was of Irish descent, so there wasn't anything really surprising that, oh yeah, your direct female line's from Europe. But his story is also an example of how in the future MTDNA may become more useful for historical and possibly genealogical research. Over the past decade or so, there's been more research done on different mutations and markers on the DNA of members of haplogroup H. And in 2019, a researcher in Newfoundland noticed that there's a particular group of mutations that have shown up almost exclusively in the mtDNA of people with Newfoundland heritage. So this researcher, his name's David Pike, believes that this unique subgroup of H, which is now called H5A5, was brought to Newfoundland by one of the early women who settled there in the 1600s. So the settlement of Newfoundland is interesting because at first it was mostly men living there that would live there temporarily as fishermen or fur traders, and there were very few women immigrating there. But as some women began to come and some of the men began to be more settled, that changed, but there was still this big gender imbalance in the population. And so the theory is that you see this H5A5 group there a lot because that may represent the genetic signature of a particular woman who came to this island population early in its settlement, and because she was one of the few early women there and had surviving daughters, and they had surviving daughters, that signature got passed on to a large percentage of that population. So about 10% of Newfoundlanders who've tested their mtDNA have this unique H5A5 genetic signature, which is found almost nowhere else in the group world. Now, my grandpa initially, when he tested, he'd only done a really basic level of testing. He had to upgrade his test to look at more mutations to see if he belonged to this H5A5 group. But when he tested it, he learned, yeah, I belong to that unique group too. And they also told us that he has a mutation of his own that's not been seen yet in any of the others who've done the testing and have H5A5. So those kinds of discoveries, along with people comparing the trees of who their earliest known ancestors are, might be helpful in the future for historians who are studying the peopling of Newfoundland, or for people who test in the future and don't know much about the maternal lineage. This might actually be a really useful piece of information for them to have if they didn't know already that they had Newfoundland ancestry. So that explains a little bit of, why you might take an mtDNA test, what kind of useful information you might learn from it. As I've said, science uses this to do some large-scale studies of populations just to learn about the history of that population. Identify the ethnic origins of your direct female line. My grandfather's results weren't particularly surprising, but when I took an mtDNA test, it was when I was a student in college and I got to take it for free. And when the results came back, my haplogroup was a West African haplogroup, which was not what I was expecting. But as I studied that branch of my family tree more, it's a Portuguese family who lived in the Madeira Islands, which are actually off the coast of West Africa. And if you study more the history of the Madeiras and how they were settled and peopled, it's less surprising that that's my maternal haplogroup. You can also use mtDNA as evidence against a very specific relationship on the female line. So if you suspect a particular woman is your direct female line ancestor, but you don't have good documentary evidence, you can test this theory by comparing your mtDNA results to the results of a direct female line descendant of that person who maybe has more evidence of their relationship to her. And so this approach, if you're just comparing haplogroups, just having a haplogroup that matches somebody isn't always going to be enough proof. If you do the more advanced marker and mutation testing that will help more. But sometimes it can be a clue, even if you haven't done the more advanced testing. I was once working with the 23andMe results of a woman who didn't know who her father was at all and had very little information about her mother's family. And her MTDNA haplogroup was pretty rare. It was a group called V8. And there was someone who was like a second cousin, first cousin kind of match. And his MTDNA group was also V8. And he had information on his profile that said where his ancestors lived. And they were in the same area as the client's maternal line. And so I suspect, based on some of those things, that probably their maternal grandmothers were closely related through their female lines. Another thing you can do with MTDNA is you can join projects, Family Tree DNA, that are related to your haplogroup or the region of the world or the ethnic group that your ancestors belong to. And so this opens up the opportunity to collaborate with others who have similar ancestry, similar research interests, and make discoveries together sometimes. So as far as who can take a test, anybody can take an MTDNA test, male or female. I'll go back to that. Or a direct female line descendant of a female ancestry you have questions about. I know a lot about my dad's mother's line, but if I didn't, I wouldn't be the one that could take the MTDNA test to learn about her direct female line, because there's a male between me and that line. So it would have to be him or one of his siblings or someone else that would be related to my grandmother through the female line. The testing process, only Family Tree DNA will give you the full results with all the mutations and markers if you're interested in your MTDNA. If you just want a haplogroup prediction, if you just want to know what part of the world that part of your tree comes from, you can do a 3-in-1 test from 23andMe or Living DNA. But if you want the full thing, it is only Family Tree DNA that offers that. And their test is called the MTDNA full sequence test. It's a cheek swab test. You mail it in, you register with their website, you get the results when they're ready. So now Y-DNA, shift gears to that. It's only a test you can take. You can only take it if you have a Y chromosome. So if you don't have a Y chromosome, go find one of your relatives that does, that descends from the line you're interested in if you want that information. Like with MTDNA, Y-DNA sampling of worldwide populations has found that the most ancient groups of Y-DNA are in Africa, specifically in nomadic peoples of southeastern Africa. The most ancient haplogroups in Y-DNA are haplogroup A and haplogroup B. The Y chromosome averages one mutation about every 150 years, though the exact mutation rates can vary a little bit depending on which marker you're comparing. Some markers mutate slightly more quickly or more slowly than others. But this predictable average, as well as the fact that Y-DNA follows the same inheritance pattern of surnames in many cultures, makes it really useful for surname research. So I just got the titles here of a couple articles that talk about some interesting historical and scholarly applications of Y-DNA. It can tell you, because of the slow mutation rate, about ancient movements of people, wars, conquests, mass migrations. If one of these things happened historically in a population, you'll find evidence of it in the Y-DNA of people living in that region. So sometimes, because of the rate at which the mutation happens and the historical records we have, we can line it up with historical events that happened, or sometimes we can identify events that aren't recorded in history but that did happen. So the first article talks about DNA that they actually extracted from ancient skeletons in Spain and Portugal, which is called Iberia. They have a hypothesis now based on this DNA study called the STEP hypothesis, which suggests that a group from the Black Sea area moved really far west and conquered large areas of Iberia in about 2500 BC. And so when you look at the Y-DNA of skeletons from this group, there's one haplogroup that's dominant prior to about 2500, but then by 2000 BC, every male skeleton they found had the new Y-DNA signature of the Black Sea people. So that was a pretty comprehensive conquest there. And if you've heard about Genghis Khan, if you haven't, look him up, but you may have heard that there's DNA evidence that he left a lot of descendants behind as he conquered areas of Asia and even Europe. And a study that was done in 2003 found that about 8% of males through a specific part of Asia he conquered have a unique DNA signature, a Y-DNA signature that was spread there about 1,000 years ago. And that, along with the places that this was found, leads science to believe that this Y-DNA probably came from him and his close male relatives who would have been part of his conquering army. So this is, as a history person, I find this stuff really fascinating, but now we're going to get to how you personally might use Y-DNA in your own family history research. So pretend you have a common surname, something like Johnson. If you had a bunch of Johnsons that all lived in, let's say, Tennessee, and you're not sure which ones you're related to and which ones you're not related to, having male Johnsons take the Y-DNA test could help you sort it out, could help you know which groups of Johnsons belong to you and which groups don't. It can be a common mistake for compiled genealogies to link all the people from the same area with the same last name as family members to one another, but that is not always the case. And so Y-DNA research can sometimes shed some light on this, which I'm going to talk about later when I use an example from my own research. There's also some cases where you may already be pretty sure that the surname was changed from what it used to be. You might have a male ancestor who was born illegitimate, or who was adopted, or took a stepfather's name, or he may have changed his name when he moved or immigrated, or because he was trying to conceal his identity. Y-DNA can help give you a clue about what surname you or this ancestor would have carried if these things hadn't happened. So, like with MTDNA, Y-DNA can tell you the ethnic origins on the direct line, which sometimes that itself is a clue. If you were expecting that your Y chromosome would show up with a European haplogroup based on your research, and you learn instead that your Y haplogroup is from an African or a Native American population, that might change how you are researching that line, might change what kind of records you look at. So, who takes the test? You can take it yourself. If you're male, if you have a Y chromosome, your father, your brother, another male relative with the surname you're interested in, or someone who has that surname who your lines may connect, but you're not sure. You're not sure how you're related. You may both trace your O'Reilly ancestors back to Ireland, but you don't know where in Ireland they come from. Maybe you even go find an O'Reilly who lives in Ireland still to this day and knows that his family's been in the area for 7 generations. And then if you match him, that's where you got to go look for the records. So that can be really helpful. How you take the test, it's also a cheek swab test from Family Tree DNA. There are 3 main levels of testing. Y37 is the current minimum. They used to have lower minimum levels of testing than that, but they found that this is a really useful place to start. And so you can take that one if you've never taken a test before and just kind of want to explore, there's also Y111 and Big Y700. That's the most advanced level they currently offer. So a little bit about how these work, the different levels of testing. The basic concept is the more markers you share with someone, the more mutations you share with them, the more recent the relationship is. So if you match 37 out of 37 markers with someone, this chart shows there's a 95% chance that you share direct male line ancestors in the past 7 generations, and 90% that you share it in the last 5. So if you have a question that's Y-DNA related and you've never tested before, 37 might be the place you start just to see if you have any good matches. One of the nice things about Y testing is you can always come back later as long as your sample is still in good shape. They keep your sample that you send in, so you can come back later and say, I want you to run the Y111 or the big Y test on my sample now. And so that can be helpful if you find someone you match closely with at 37 and you want to explore a little bit more. How close really is this relationship? The more advanced levels of testing will tell you with a greater level of precision how closely related you are. So I put that Y37 and Y111, they're SNPs, or sometimes called SNP testing. And then big Y700 does STR testing, which that stands for short tandem repeat. SNP stands for single nucleotide polymorphisms. You don't really need to know what each of those mean, just STR markers are, there's more of them that they test, and they're a little bit more precise as far as being able to predict relationships with other matches and where your line and their line might have diverged from one another. So if you have a question about Y-DNA, start with 37, upgrade later if it makes sense. That's the general advice on that. So here's a basic example of what your Y-DNA STR values might look like. If you do have Y-DNA results, there are other pages they'll display for you as well to show you different aspects of what your results mean. But this is some of the data where it'll tell you what haplogroup you belong to. This is what the mutation and marker information looks like. They'll also, so it's also helpful to compare surname information with the people you match. Are you matching people that have your same surname? Or are you matching a large group of people that have a different surname? And then how many markers you match, you can compare that information. So if you end up matching someone that has your same surname, all or most of your markers are matching, that's a pretty good indication that you have a recent genealogical relationship on your direct male line. Sometimes there's cases where you share a lot of markers with someone, but not a surname. Sometimes that could be an indication there was a name change in one line or the other, which can be helpful if you have a brick wall. But you do have to be careful, especially at the lower levels of testing, because sometimes you share markers with someone who has a more ancient relationship with you, maybe before the time that surnames were common and your ancestors just kind of lived in the same area. So that might be a case where if there is at least a pattern of, well, I'm a Jones, but I'm matching a bunch of Smiths, maybe you do study their line, or you upgrade both of your tests a little bit more to see, is this really a close relationship? So here's another example of what some of your results would look like. This is a list of matches that belong to Paul Dunn, who is another person who works with DNA at the BYU library. The genetic distance, what that means is the number of markers that you have different from the other tester. So his first match there, he has 0 markers different. That is a close match. That is somebody that probably shares the same ancestor with him within the past couple hundred years. So people, when they do test, they can list their earliest known ancestor on the male line. You'll notice Mr. Henry down there. He didn't list an ancestor, but you can compare that information if they've shared that. And you can also contact matches. There is a way you can go to a page for each match and find their email address and contact them. And so that's really helpful. So this kind of information can be helpful. Say you were a Dunn that tested and you only had your line traced back to a great-grandfather that was born in 1880. You could look at this list of people you're matching and be like, oh, okay, some of them have ancestors from Pennsylvania or Virginia, and they're going back into the early 1800s or even the 1700s. And maybe that's where I should be looking for my connection. Maybe my ancestor came to a different state from Virginia or Pennsylvania, but he's related to these Dunns back in that other location. So on the left side of this slide is an image of Family Tree DNA's page where you can search for surname projects. You don't have to join a surname project when you Y-DNA test. You don't have to join a surname project to find matches. However, it can be really helpful. So you can search the entire database for anyone that matches you at a certain distance, but surname projects can be really helpful because these projects are a gathering place for researchers that are interested in the same surname you're interested in. You can join a project that already exists, or you can start one if there isn't one already. A lot of these projects are surname projects. There are also projects for particular haplogroups or particular ethnic groups or people that have ancestors in a particular location. So one thing to know about surname groups is you won't always match all the other people that have tested with your surname. You may not even match anybody closely if people haven't tested that are closely related. And by closely related with Y-DNA, I mean that's within the past couple hundred years or more, but still, it just is chance depending on who's tested. So my husband, he has taken a Y-DNA test. His surname is Stoddard. There are a lot of American Stoddards and a lot that have tested, and even some British ones that have tested, but there don't seem to be any who have tested that are Y matches to him. But Stoddard, like a lot of last names, was an occupation name. It meant somebody who took care of horses. And so these other Stoddards that tested probably also had ancestors that took care of horses, but that doesn't mean they're related at any time recently. But even with that, for him to be aware that there are these other groups of Stoddards could be helpful to his research on his own family. It can help him distinguish whether Stoddards he researches in records belong to his group or belong to one of the other groups. And often, even if you aren't a Y match, these other researchers in your surname group, they're just interested in gathering records on people with that surname in general and are sometimes really expert on people that carry that surname, and they can have information that could be helpful to you and vice versa. So the right-hand picture is an example of a homepage, the homepage for my maiden name surname project, the Woodall Surname Project. And it's a great example, the history of the Woodall Project, of the kinds of discoveries that you can make when you do Y-DNA research. So going back into, like, at least as far as the 1970s, that's kind of as far back as I've heard, there were several very dedicated researchers researching the Woodall surname in the United States. They lived in various states. They were doing work, research the old-fashioned way, going to courthouses and archives to look at physical copies of records, because this is before the computer age, and there's snail mail, writing letters to one another or to anybody that's interested in their research, and just trying to piece these things together. My dad, personally, he started researching history in the 1980s, but he hit a roadblock pretty quick a few generations back from him. His great-grandfather lost his parents at an early age. The parents both died within a year of each other and left a lot of young children and a lot of the history of the family, and that knowledge of where they had come from was lost. So he eventually did make contact with some of these other researchers in the 1990s. Some of them had written books. They had information for him about where his line had probably come from. They had reunions they held even, and all traced their lines back to a common ancestor in colonial Virginia that they believed was the ancestor of most of the early American Woodalls. So in about 2005, my dad and 3 of these others that were longtime researchers decided to start a Woodall Y-DNA surname project and get as many Woodalls, male Woodalls, as they could to test. This would be helpful to future researchers and possibly even help them trace the family out of Virginia back into England. That was their ultimate dream, especially if they could get some English Woodalls to test. But once the results came in, just for the families of these 4 group founders, which were my dad and a woman named Verna, a man named Andy, and a man named Steve, there were surprises for each of them. It was a little more complicated than they thought. Verna had a male relative test, and his DNA showed that their direct male line was of Native American descent. Another researcher, Andy, found an illegitimacy in his line. He realized after the match was not there with some of the other testers, and that he did more of his research, that one of his further back ancestors had taken his mother's surname, which was Woodall, rather than his father's surname, which turned out to be Duncan. And then my dad and this 4th researcher, Steve, they discovered they belonged to 2 different haplogroups as well. Their common ancestor should have been a man named John Woodall, who died in the 1750s in Virginia and left 2 adult sons, John and William. Steve was a descendant of John, and my dad was a descendant of William. And as more people tested that descend from either man, they're grouped into 2 separate groups. The John descendants have one Y-DNA signature, and the William descendants have another. We don't know why yet. We don't know if one of these men was a stepson or born illegitimately, but they were brothers, or maybe we've confused multiple men living in the same area with the same name. It's very easy to do. And so that's our current thing that we're investigating, and hopefully we'll figure out is why that happened. But it is right now an easy way to sort any Woodall who comes up with one of those 2 signatures. If you have this one, you're from William's line. If you have that one, you're from John's line. So I love this picture and I love this story, even though it turned out differently than everybody was expecting. This was at one of the Woodall reunions that they did before all these Y-DNA results came out. They found out that none of them are actually related in the way that they thought they were. And they were kind of shocked, but I loved this email my dad sent to the others as they were all trying to come to terms with the fact that their DNA was telling a different story than what they thought the story was. He said, as we chart our family past the 4th generation, we are no longer relying on modern hard fact records or the first-hand testimony of surviving or relatively recently deceased ancestors. Any combination or of misunderstood paper gleanings, as well as the possibility of grafting in of other DNA types, would give us the DNA patchwork our Woodall Surname project has thus far produced. However, just look at the friendships we have grown and larger network of Woodall researchers we have developed. And I love that ability to look at optimistically at what you can do with a surname project and what you can do as you keep an open mind and use both kinds of evidence, use the DNA and use the traditional evidence to figure out these things. And sometimes the best thing you get out of this process is the relationships you form, the people you are able to work with as you're working to learn more about your family story. So I hope as you do your own research, you can keep this sort of openness about whatever you may discover when you receive your results, and appreciate the complexity of the biology and the circumstances that made you who you are and made your family members who they were. So it's like with the autosomal DNA testing, Y-DNA testing is usually about a 1 to 2 month turnaround. So if you do that, or also same thing with mitochondrial DNA, the best thing you can do is work on building your tree so you can compare it to results when you get them, and also, you know, put that attached to your results so that others that are searching can also benefit from that, and join a surname or region project if that's applicable, and get help understanding the results once you get them if you have questions. My next page has some links that are helpful if you're wanting to learn more about Y-DNA or mitochondrial DNA. And I will take a look at the chat. I see there's a bunch of questions in there.
Yeah, Sarah, there's one way back at the beginning Robert had, but I believe you answered it. Will I acquire MTDNA from my father, or will it be 100% from my mother?
It should be 100% of your mother, from your mother. There's very odd out there situations where people have gotten it from their father, but that usually results in major health issues. So I would expect that would be your mother's. And so if you're interested in your father's maternal line, either he or a sibling of his would be an ideal candidate to do MTDNA if you're interested in his mother's line.
Then I have an exact match. Would this still be a MRCA within the last 200 years? Is that the same as a zero genetic distance? Now, that's hopefully you know what we're talking about there.
Yeah. No, so Chris's information, I'm looking at that right quick. Yes, that's correct on the SNP and the STR stuff. SNP is definitely gives you a lot more information. So if it's to the question about the 25 marker match, that is an older level of testing that they don't even offer anymore. And if they've only tested at that 25 marker level and they're a different surname, that's a situation where it may or may not be a recent relationship. You would want that person to do more advanced levels of testing, because sometimes you can be a genetic distance of 0 at 25 markers with somebody, and the relationship is more ancient and can be maybe before the time even that surnames were common, which usually in Western Europe, that's 1400s, 1500s, when people started widely adopting surnames. Yeah, same as you're saying, Chris. Does Family Tree have researchers? I'm guessing you're asking about Family Tree DNA. I believe, yeah. So I believe they have companies that they will refer people to for research. They don't have a team of researchers themselves. They're mostly in the business of providing tests and providing analysis and those kinds of tools to better understand your test results.
Sarah, there at the BYU Family History Library, we do have someone who helps people with their DNA questions, and that is very experienced in this field, and it's free of charge. There's no, all you do is contact virtual help desk, and we can put them together.
Sure, yeah, definitely. That's an option. I know that there are some different groups online too of people that are just interested in DNA research, and sometimes there are volunteers on those groups that will answer your questions or help you with some of the research you might be doing. So there are ways to get volunteer help and free help, and definitely I know they have some good people that are good with that at BYU. Yes, that's correct, Chris. The project managers, those are a great resource if you join a surname project or another project, is they're usually people that have done a lot of research on that surname or on that topic, and they can help you understand sort of technical things of family tree DNA and the Y or MTDNA results, and also they often know a lot about the different groups and the different people that have tested and the ancestors that they're researching.